Brine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson, and congratulations to the Honourable Lady from Putney for introducing the debate and securing it. As Chair of the All-Party Group on Children and Early Years, just want to make a brief contribution, if I may. I hope the Honourable Lady will join the group, and we look forward to having her as a speaker at our next meeting, I believe, so she'll be very welcome. A couple of points. Just first on occupancy and demand for places. Demand is, on average, 21% lower than it was in 2019. Now, the government had been basing early entitlement funding on pre-COVID attendance rates, but it was announced just before Christmas that this would stop in the spring term. New guidance has not yet been issued on whether councils should continue to fund places for children not currently attending. That said, I was pleased to learn that Hampshire, my own county, have said just last week they'll be guaranteeing funding until half term, which is good, but obviously very short term, whether parents decide to keep their children at home or not due to the pandemic. More generally, I just want to place on record a survey by the excellent Early Years Alliance in November, which found that 56% of providers said basing fees on current occupancy would have a negative or very negative impact on them. And of those, 45% said they didn't think they'd be able to remain viable for more than 6 months as things stand. Now, this means that the decision to remove this support could result in some big closures by late spring. It's that urgent, remembering, as we do, that early years settings are open and allowing parents to go to work. Turning to testing and vaccinations, it's hugely welcome, as the Honourable Lady said, that early years staff will be offered asymptomatic testing. I wonder whether the Minister might provide, when she closes, some detail on when and how this will be accessible and what support and training practitioners will be offered with administering the tests and, of course, ensuring that any associated costs with them are covered. Some practitioners have, of course, been offered vaccinations by the local hospital, and some will obviously come within the first 4 groups, but this is obviously not the case for all. Early years practitioners are bravely continuing to come into work despite the prevalence of the virus currently in society, and they should, in my opinion, be offered the vaccine as a priority in phase 2 of its rollout, along with other educators and critical workers. Now, I made this point in this very chamber yesterday, so I won't labour it again, Mr. Robertson. Thirdly, self-isolation and COVID in early years settings. Look, we know it's a constant juggle for settings to remain open due to the number of staff self-isolating. Nurseries have had to form closed bubbles of specific staff and children, meaning that if there is a positive test in one bubble, the other children need to isolate. This obviously has an impact on parents, particularly critical workers, so offering the early education sector routine testing and prioritising it for the vaccine rollout, I would argue, is key. Furthermore, Mr. Robertson, having a lot of staff self-isolating and testing positive also means that practitioners are struggling to maintain the important staff ratios. I've heard many nursery owners say to me they're not clear whether, if they had to close due to a lack of available staff, they'll lose their entitlement funding. They will typically also lose parents' fees in this situation, which means that paying staff and keeping up with the other costs, such as rent and utilities, becomes a real challenge for them. I think it's also important to note that for childminders, who are so often overlooked in this whole early years debate, and I declare my interest because I'm married to one, a positive test will almost always mean the temporary closure of the entire business with all the impact on those who rely on that childminder. And just finally, Mr. Robertson, it would be remiss of me not to mention the pre-existing funding challenges which have already been touched upon, which never went away and were, of course, the subject of the debate I led in this place just last month. The early education sector was, I argue and continue to argue, experiencing market failure long before the pandemic. Funding levels have not covered the cost of provision for many years, with the independent research company, the excellent CEDA, showing that even if occupancy levels were exactly the same now as they were in the spring of 2019, some 77% of childcare providers would still be coping with a shortfall of £2 for every hour for every funded 2-year-old and 90 pence per hour for every funded 3 and 4-year-old. That drag becomes a real problem and is now a real problem. So the 1.2% increase in funding rates due to come into effect in April of this year and I thank the Minister for that, but it equates to, at best, just 6 or 8 pence per hour per child in practice for childcare providers across England, at a time when we should remember the national living wage is due to increase by 2.2%. So in closing, I still believe we need to commission an independent, meaningful review of early years policy and funding to ensure that the gap between the cost of delivering early education and the rate paid per hour per child to providers is closed and eventually eliminated. If we don't, we're going to lose a lot of provision, which will serve nobody, and I would argue be the opposite of levelling up. And finally, Mr Robertson, can I just say how sad I think it is that sittings in Westminster Hall will not continue after today if the motion tonight goes ahead. As a former minister who has spent many hours sitting there responding to debates in this House, good scrutiny leads to good policy and good government. And without it, we are all worse off. Thank you.